10 creepy hotel mysteries that are still unsolved. Hotels are considered to be our homes when we're away from home, a place to lay our hat, kick up our feet, and relax in solitude. That isn't always the case, however. Sometimes, people check in, but they never check out. At least, not the way they expected. 1. Donald Fraser, Racecourse Hotel. The brutal murder of Christchurch publican Donald Fraser in 1933, has remained unsolved for the last 74 years. Rick Stevens has spent the last year investigating the case. Don Fraser, the licensee of Riccarton's Racecourse Hotel, was murdered in his bed in the early hours of November 17, 1933. This was a brutal killing, akin to an execution. Both charges from a double-barreled shotgun were fired into Fraser's chest at close range. Neither the killer nor the shotgun was ever found, and the motive for the crime was never known to the general public at the time. The case caused a brief sensation in Christchurch in 1933, and 1934, before being added to the litany of New Zealand's unsolved crimes, and largely forgotten. However, just because the case was not solved does not mean that it cannot be explained. In the last 12 months, I have gained access to the previously restricted police files on the murder, and the story to be found there is an extraordinary one. One of the things that made it extraordinary was the character of the victim. Donald Fraser was a thoroughly unpleasant bully who would pick fights with his customers and throw them out of the hotel if they did anything which displeased him. After his death, however, secrets about him were uncovered which showed a different side to his nature. Another extraordinary character in the tale was Fraser's wife, Elizabeth, a woman who might scarcely seem believable if she was presented to us in a work of fiction. The files, and the separate, voluminous accounts of Fraser's inquest in mid-1934, provide us with a unique and remarkable view of hotel life and a group within New Zealand society in the 1930s. It is a view into a world which otherwise might have been lost to history, with its secrets and infidelities, its extravagances and fast living, its double-dealing and criminality. The files also show that, at the height of the Great Depression, there was plenty of money to be spent and made at the Racecourse Hotel. Gold sovereigns and large sums of cash were even hidden in cupboards and wardrobes. And a poignant subplot to the story of Fraser's life and violent death concerns the fate of his racehorse, Silver Ring. The gelding was the best 2-year-old in New Zealand in 1932 before, inexplicably, falling out of form for the last year of Fraser's life. Then, almost as soon as Fraser was in his grave, Silver Ring made a spectacular comeback, racing for Fraser's estate and giving the dead publican a posthumous success which eluded him in real life. Over the next 4 days, the full story of the murder at the Racecourse Hotel will be revealed. Donald Fraser was born in Charters Towers, Queensland, on April 10, 1892. The son of an English miner and an Irish woman. The family, including Donald's younger brother Richard, Dick, moved to New Zealand about 1909. Fraser had been apprenticed to a draper's firm in Queensland, but as a young man on the west coast, he worked as a locomotive fireman. He left the railways department after a dispute over agging some other young employees, possibly an early manifestation of his tendency to become quarrelsome and violent. About this time he was also accused of an indecent assault on a young woman. Although the charge was dismissed, Fraser avoided his generation's exodus for foreign battlefields during World War I, but was called up in August 1918 to spend the later weeks of the war in the safety of Featherstone Camp. Until entering the hotel trade in 1927, Fraser lived an itinerant lifestyle in drapery, working for 9 employers in 6 towns or cities over 14 years from 1913. One job, in New Plymouth, lasted only 4 months. The longest spell in one place was when he was employed as a manager in Hokitika between 1920 and 1925. His work pattern suggests that Fraser did not like working for other people, and was happiest when employed as the boss. This hypothesis would suit his generally abrasive personality. It would also help explain why Fraser decided to enter the hotel trade on his own account. He took over the license of the Doncaster Hotel at Washdyke, near Timaru, in August 1927, and moved to Riccarton in June 1929. In the meantime, however, Fraser had become a family man. He married Elizabeth Walton at the Dublin Street Methodist Church in Wanganui on April 6, 1915. Joyce was born in Wellington on March 29, 1917, and a son, Clutter Fraser, was born in Hora on February 19, 1926. Along with Joyce, Clutter was present in the Racecourse Hotel on the night his father was killed, as was his girl cousin, Alwyn Walton. Joyce would have a prominent part to play in the investigation into her father's murder, and the inquest. As the murder investigation progressed, it became clear that Fraser had made enemies, usually through his hasty temper and violence. Several of them were interviewed in the course of the investigation. They included a horse trainer who had been caught by Fraser urinating against the wall of the hotel while drunk about 1931. Fraser assaulted him, and he never went back. A Methven farmer said he bore no malice towards Fraser even though the publican had struck him at an after-hours drinking session at the Racecourse Hotel the weekend before the murder. A labourer fell foul of Fraser when he tied his horse to the hotel fence. Police noted that Fraser gave him a hiding for it. In October 1931, Fraser refused to give a reference to a departing employee, causing her husband to intervene. The subsequent brawl was reported to police but no action was taken. A William George Thomas, alias George William Thomas, alias Matthews, was arrested at the Racecourse Hotel by police with Fraser's assistance in 1930, and charged with multiple false pretenses all over New Zealand. He threatened to kill the publican. None of these people was believed to have murdered Fraser, but the list no doubt could have been longer. In the opinion of Detective Sergeant J. B. Bruce Young, the out-of-town detective who took over the case from his Christchurch colleagues in late 1933, Fraser was not a man well liked by frequenters of the hotel as he was considered to be mean and was very aggressive towards men under the influence of drink. Young went on to say, he was a big man and could use his fists, frequently picked quarrels with his customers over trifles and, as soon as an argument started, he would strike them and throw them out of the hotel. The Racecourse Hotel still stands, hard by the Riccarton racetrack from which it takes its name, although it is much changed and a vastly different establishment now than it was then. In 1933, it was on the very fringe of the Christchurch urban area, still largely surrounded by paddocks, hedges and ponds. An infrequent tram service terminated outside its front door. The hotel was a 19th century two-storied concrete and brick structure on an acre of ground, with outbuildings and stables. As one entered the front door, the bar opened to the left off a central hallway, while the dining room, an office and the kitchen were on the right. A staircase led from the hallway to accommodation and sitting rooms on the first floor. A second stairway was at the back. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, opening onto a front balcony, Donald Fraser would be shot dead. The main players in what the tabloid newspaper New Zealand Truth called one of the most mysterious murders in the history of New Zealand crime were the hotel's occupants and guests at a drinking party which went on late into the evening of November 16, 1933, finishing a couple of hours before Fraser's death. There was Donald Fraser, drunk and ill at ease on the last night of his life, and his wife, Elizabeth, whose life as a racing publican's wife provided her with the things she most wanted: good clothes, drink and cigarettes, fast living and money. Their daughter Joyce Fraser, at the age of 16, considered herself a modern young woman pursuing her own idea of freedom through her friendships with young jockeys and stable lads. Among a raft of lesser characters, Sidney Higgs, a stud master, was the hotel's only long-term resident guest. Ted Russell, a freezing worker and a friend of Donald Fraser's, drank heavily and although described as a simple man, had an illegal sideline as a bookmaker. Marion Wood was Elizabeth Fraser's closest confidant, and indeed was described by Elizabeth as the only friend she had made since arriving in Christchurch 4 years before. The drinks party was, of course, in breach of the law. New Zealand pubs were supposed to close at 6 o'clock in 1933. Fraser had been serving drinks after hours for years, getting away with it, and always currying favour with the constabulary by being obliging and helpful when dealing with them. Through history's window onto that fatal night of November 16, 1933, we can see guests arriving and leaving by tram and bicycle, can see the partygoers drinking spirits and portergaff, a mixture of stout and lemonade, can note the hotel clock running 20 minutes fast. The studmaster Higgs, more sober than most, has not joined the party but has been writing letters in the kitchen before heading to his bed, and settling down after hearing the 3-yard radio announcer say goodnight. Joyce Fraser, coming in from talking to two young lads outside, tartly tells an older woman who admonishes her to realize that times have moved on, and young people do not behave as their elders did. Towards 11 p.m., the carousers finish with a bottle of champagne. Jack Wilson, the hotel porter, cuts sandwiches for a late supper. Ted Russell leaves twice, returning for his share of the sandwiches before finally weaving his way down Yaldhurst Road on a borrowed lady's bicycle. Through these tableaus walks Donald Fraser, or staggers perhaps, for he is very drunk. Fraser serves customers, conducts small items of business, and places an arm around his daughter while sitting on a couch, then sinks onto the third step of the main staircase before he is helped upstairs to his bed. Once the partygoers had left and Higgs and Wilson were long gone to bed, it was left to Elizabeth Fraser to bear testimony to what happened next. She said she and her husband were in bed together by 11:45 p.m. and talked for a while before a car pulled up and the front doorbell rang. Donald Fraser called down from the balcony and, getting no response, went down to answer the door. Elizabeth said she was asleep by the time he returned and the next thing she heard was a loud explosion in the bedroom. She said she did not see the person who shot her husband, and presently she was in the hallway outside the bedroom, screaming. When Higgs was called from his room he found the force of the two shotgun blasts at close range had been sufficient to lift Fraser out of his bed, and deposit his body onto the floor. The killer was nowhere to be seen. Body onto the 2. The Smith Brothers, Severs Hotel. Strange how you can stumble onto things. While researching the history of the Great Depression in northwestern Connecticut, I found a murder mystery. It began in New Milford 8 decades ago, and ended in Muskogee, Oklahoma. The tale is pieced together here from press reports of the time. In the 1920s, before the Depression struck, one of the most successful financial companies around was the New Milford Security Company, which bought up mortgages on western farms and paid the interest on those loans to its Litchfield County investors. After the crash of 1929, and two bad crop seasons, the farmers started defaulting, and the Oklahoma broker representing the New Milford Company was suspected of stealing. Powell J. Seeley, a company director and founder of the Washington Supply Hardware and Feed Store, was brought in to clean up the mess. He called on 3 other directors to join him on a trip to Oklahoma, where most of the mortgaged farms were located. They were David Smith of Sharon, his brother, George Smith of Cornwall, and John Wygg of Sharon. All were respected in their communities. Jump ahead to the night of April 26, 1930. The assistant manager of the Severs Hotel in Muskogee, Oklahoma, received a frantic call at about 8:35 p.m. from roommate 19. A male voice said that 2 men had been murdered. The desk man called police and rushed to the room. There on the floor were 2 well-dressed men in their 60s, lying in pools of their own blood, with bullet holes in their heads and bodies. The Smith brothers were dead. Seeley and White stood mutely by the bed, staring at the bodies with ashen faces. Muskogee Police Chief Tom Graves and 2 detectives arrived soon after, and asked them what happened. White said he had been sitting in the room with the Smiths when 2 unknown men burst into the room. "What do you want?" George Smith demanded. "We'll show you what we want," said one of the men, who drew a pistol. Both brothers grappled with the assailants, but were shot and fell to the floor. Too stunned to move, Weck said the 2 killers grabbed him, tied him to a chair and gagged him. Seeley, who said he had been in the corridor bathroom shaving, had heard nothing. He returned to the room, saw what happened, released Twike and called the front desk. They told police they had no idea who the 2 assailants were or why they shot the Smith brothers, or for that matter, why they left Twike alive. Chief Graves clearly didn't believe the men, and took them in for questioning. Police soon discovered they weren't dealing with traveling salesmen. They were all prominent citizens of the distant state of Connecticut. Seeley and the Smith brothers had served in their state legislature. George Smith was the probate judge in Cornwall. White had been a first selectman of Sharon. The Oklahoma crime created a sensation across the country, prompting reporters to flood into the western city of 35,000, later made famous by the Merle Haggard song Aki's from Muskogee. Editorials in Connecticut papers rallied behind Seeley and Wyke, saying they had been railroaded by Aki cops. Even the families of the Smith brothers said they were sure the two men were innocent. When Seeley and Wyke were arraigned, the prosecutor suddenly reversed himself and said there wasn't enough evidence to hold them. So, the judge released them, and they returned home to what was described in the press as a hero's welcome. Seeley kept silent. Wyke talked. He accused Oklahoma loan broker Virgil Koss, who had sold mortgages to the New Milford Company and was suspected of nefarious dealings, of hiring hitmen to kill the two brothers, who were carrying evidence of his fraud. Such evidence was not found, and Koss was never indicted. A month after the murders, police arrested a man for burglary and sent his picture to Wyke, who identified him as one of the killers. The man, R.L. Benton, who had been a member of the infamous Carpis Barker gang, later escaped from jail and was killed 5 years later in a shootout with police. With that, Oklahoma authorities closed the Smith murder file. For years later, crime watchers and newspapers in the West speculated about the puzzling and unfinished aspects of the case, but most agreed on one point: the answer probably lay in the vaults of a Connecticut financial company, which closed its doors for good after the murders. Though each man admitted to being in or around the hotel at the time of the murders and each was positively identified by hotel staff, there was never enough evidence to put any of them on trial. The case remains unsolved. 3. 4 women, Golden Key Motel. While millions of tourists flock each year to the boardwalks and casinos of Atlantic City, a dark question looms over this glittery city. Who murdered 4 women and dumped their bodies in a drainage ditch on the outskirts of town nearly 7 years ago? No arrests have ever been made, but authorities tell FoxNews.com they are quietly and aggressively working the case, contacting police in Florida, Missouri and Alaska in recent months for possible connections to killings there. On November 20, 2006, 2 women stumbled upon the body of 35-year-old Kim Ruffo, lying face down in runoff water filled with fecal matter and chemical waste about 50 yards behind the Golden Key Motel in West Atlantic City. The call to police that followed uncovered a ghastly scene: the bodies of 3 other women, also in the ditch, their remains separated by no more than 50 yards. This fits the FBI definition of a serial killer, Atlantic County Prosecutor James P. McClain said in an interview last week. From the facts gathered during the investigation, it could have been a local person or it could have been a transient. Ruffo, Tracy Ann Roberts, 23, Barbara Breda, 42, and Molly Diltz, 19, all worked as prostitutes in the area. The women were also mothers who had fled dysfunctional lives and found themselves walking the streets of Atlantic City and booking clients to make money and, in some cases, feed drug addictions. Diltz, who was killed a month prior to being found, was so badly decomposed that a cause of death could not be determined. The same was true for Brida. Roberts was asphyxiated, authorities determined, and Ruffo, the most recent victim, was strangled with a rope or cord. The women were barefoot, but fully clothed, their heads facing east toward the lights of the casinos. The medical examiner detected high levels of a recreational drug in 3 of the bodies. Police have never named a suspect in the case, but McClain said authorities have identified more than one person of interest, though he declined to provide names. Terry Oleson, a 41-year-old handyman from Illinois, NJ, was of great interest to police from the beginning. Oleson, who said he is innocent, was living in the Golden Key Motel, a seedy lodging notorious for drugs and prostitution. At the time of the murders, Oleson told FoxNews.com that he was repairing a friend's porch in the area and needed a place to stay nearby because his home in Illinois was some 60 miles away. Oleson lived in a room at the Golden Key for free in exchange for doing occasional repairs on the motel's sinks and toilets. After watching news of the murders on television, Oleson's then-girlfriend called police and implicated him in the crimes. Oleson said the two were in a domestic dispute and on the verge of breaking up, calling her actions vindictive. Oleson said he was interrogated by police without a lawyer for up to 8 hours, during which he claims police said, "We know you did it." When detectives arrived at Oleson's home in Alloway, they discovered hidden video cameras that only heightened their interest. One camera, inside the home, captured the teenage daughter of Oleson's girlfriend in various stages of undress, according to investigators. Oleson said he was not aware of such images at the time, and later pleaded guilty to an invasion of privacy charge. Oleson submitted DNA samples to authorities, but no forensic match has been made between Oleson and the victims, according to his attorney, James Leonard. "To date, we've never heard what the results are, but I think you can draw those conclusions," said Leonard, who, with Oleson, spoke to Fox News in a sit-down interview. "We wouldn't be sitting here today if Mr. Oleson's DNA linked him in any way, shape or form to any of these women. I think he, Oleson, presented an easy target to them," Leonard said. Adding to the mystery, self-described sex worker Denise Hill identified another individual as the killer, a man named Eldred Raymond Burchell, who called himself the Riven Man, an apparent reference to Washington State's Green River Killer, who murdered at least 71 women, many prostitutes, during the 1980s and 1990s. Hill told FoxNews.com that Burchell, a drifter, spent time with her in Atlantic City around the time of the murders and confessed to killing people. Burchell, whose whereabouts is unknown, could not be reached for comment. McLean said a common myth about serial killers is that they cannot stop of their own volition, a mistruth that has some convinced the killer is either incarcerated or dead. It is not unknown or even rare for serial killers to engage in a series of killings, which qualify as serial murders, and they do stop, either because they have no more opportunity or because they deal with the root cause of why they kill in a different way, McLean said. He also addressed common perceptions that police agencies care little about the disappearances and deaths of those who work in the sex trade. "No one should ever think that because someone works as a prostitute or works in the sex trade that they're not going to get law enforcement's best efforts. Everybody counts. Every person's a child of God. We are never going to give up on it until we charge and convict someone," said McLean, the third prosecutor to take office since the 2006 murders. "I have great hope in justice. I'll never give up on that." Kate D'Adamo, spokeswoman for the New York-based Sex Workers Outreach Project, said it's likely other women encountered the killer but did not report it to police for fear of a prostitution arrest. D'Adamo said that, despite societal opinion, sex workers span every different identity that you could ever imagine, and that their decision to enter the trade is almost always an economic one. "I think we should strive to live in a society where we don't qualify the victims and decide based on our moral judgments whether or not they should have access to justice," she said. 4. Richard, Connecticut, Phillips Motel. Today the Budget Inn and Suites, located at 8450 South Cicero Avenue, is an economy segment hotel boasting heart-shaped hot tub suites at affordable rates. Back in the 1960s, it was known as the Phillips Motel Lounge. An advertisement from that era promoted the Phillips Motel as offering kitchenette apartments, free TV, and phones in all rooms. Although the ad stated an Oak Lawn address, the motel actually fell within the boundaries of unincorporated Stickney Township. The area officially became Burbank 2 years later when the city incorporated in 1970. It was inside this nondescript building on a cold winter's night in 1968, that a young man was slain, making it the location of Burbank's oldest unsolved homicide. During the early morning hours of January 4, 1968, 19-year-old Richard, Connecticut, 8354 South Lawler Avenue, found himself working the front desk of the Phillips Motel as the lone night clerk that evening. Motel guests and patrons of the Melody Lounge located on the inn's second floor had no idea that anything was amiss until around 1:45 a.m. when Connecticut staggered up the stairway connecting the restaurant on the main floor to the upstairs bar, clutching his abdomen, shouted help and collapsed. Connecticut was alive but unconscious. An ambulance from the Burbank Manor Fire District was summoned, and Connecticut was rushed to Christ Community Hospital in Oak Lawn where he was pronounced dead on arrival. Connecticut's body bore a gunshot wound to the right side of the torso and a small nick on the left index finger between the fingernail and first knuckle that had bled. At the time, Cook County Sheriff's Police had jurisdiction in South Stickney Township, and headed up the death investigation, which they quickly classified as a homicide. Although a motive was not clear, detectives believed the murder was a result of an armed robbery gone badly. A paucity of physical evidence stymied investigators from the onset. The cash register was closed and locked, and it was later determined that no money was missing. There were no signs of a struggle, and police were unable to locate a weapon or bullet casings. Detectives processing the front desk area made 2 observations. They found blood smears on a metal cabinet behind the cash register and noted 2 full warm cups of coffee on the counter. Police questioned patrons of the motel and lounge, but besides a few individuals who said they heard a gunshot, no one reported seeing anything unusual. An off-duty employee who lived at the motel told investigators he saw 2 men drive away from the motel about the time of the shooting. He described both men as white males, between 20 to 30 years old. The employee further described the passenger as being about 5 feet 8 inches tall and wearing a light gray waist-length jacket with dark pants. The official case report described the vehicle the men were driving as a gray 1950 to 1956 Chrysler, SICK, product with the right rear fender dented and rusty. Hoping this information was the break they needed, police radioed a stop, wanted for investigation order on the rusty Chrysler, but no other units spotted the suspect's car. With only very little information to go on in tracking down possible suspects and lack of DNA analysis at the time, the investigation reached a dead end. The case still remains unsolved. Although it's been 46 years since Richard Connecticut was murdered, it is still being worked by the Cook County Sheriff's Police Department Cold Case Unit on the slim hope of catching the assailants. According to the sheriff's website, the Cook County Sheriff's Police Department Cold Case Unit is responsible for investigating unsolved murders dating back to the 1950s. And investigating missing person investigations. The unit focuses specifically on cases that occurred in the unincorporated areas of the county of Cook, though they are often called in to assist other suburban police agencies as well. The Cold Case Unit is staffed with a detective sergeant and 3 detectives whose mission is to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves by seeking answers and justice for the victims and their families. 5. Albert Anastasia, Park Sheraton Hotel. When you see the lifeless, blood-stained body of Albert Anastasia folded in the fetal position on the floor next to a barber chair, it's difficult to claim the mob museum is glorifying mobsters. Just ask Anastasia, aka Lord High Executioner, about that. Or not. The chair in which Anastasia was groomed and, famously, clipped is the latest artifact added to the mob museum, set to open in December in the old federal courthouse and post office at 300 Stewart Avenue in downtown Las Vegas. For the announcement, Mayor Oscar Goodman, museum curators Dennis and Kathy Barry, former FBI agent Ellen Knowlton, who heads the 300 Stewart Avenue non-profit group affiliated with the project, noted New York mob artifact collector Artie Nash, Jim Germain, a longtime Las Vegas resort executive and Mob Museum board member, and Mob Museum Chief Administrative Officer Jonathan Nullman filed into Goodman's attraction unto itself office at City Hall. Those expecting to see a chair stained with the blood of the man who headed up the fatalistic mob outfit Murder Incorporated would have been disappointed. The chair has been largely refurbished in the way the porn stars would recondition such an artifact to sale at gold and silver pawn, refurbished with new chrome and upholstery. But the chair is the real deal, passed along by a street Louis collector to legendary comedian Henny Youngman, himself an active memorabilia collector, and finally sold to Nash, who is now working with the museum to supply such artifacts to the $42 million project. What we're trying to accomplish here is to have true artifacts that represent the true history of organized crime and the history of law enforcement's efforts to fight organized crime, Goodman said from the podium, moments before Nash pulled away the black blanket revealing the old chair. One of the criticisms that I have heard over the years is that there would somehow be a glorification of the criminal element, and we've always assured people that this would be a very straightforward, warts and all presentation. I think today exemplifies exactly what we're trying to accomplish. Warts and all, and even bullet wounds and all, is the approach here. The story behind the chair was that on October 25, 1957, Anastasia was murdered in the Grasso barber shop at the Park Sheraton Hotel in New York City, which today is the Park Central Hotel. The barber shop itself is now a Starbucks, so the spot where Anastasia was gunned down is still serving double shots. Badi a bum. The crime has never been solved, making it one of the great mysteries of mob law. Anastasia, boss of the Gambino crime family, was the overlord of Murder Incorporated, which is reported to have enacted 400 to 700 murders. Anastasia's was a rare hit in that it took place during the day, in a public forum, and was the result of a leadership dispute between the Genovese and Gambino crime families. Clearly, organized crime divisions had no human resources department to serve as an arbiter in such disagreements. As Kathy Barry noted, it is a challenge to verify that such pieces of memorabilia are authentic. This chair was easy to track, given that the collector in St. Louis kept accurate records, and Youngman held the chair for decades. But museum officials have bemoaned such tantalizing artifacts as a cane purportedly used by Lucky Luciano that was manufactured more than 10 years after his death. We really cannot say enough about the importance of having connoisseurs and experts connected with our museum, Kathy Barry said. We can guarantee that the artifacts we have are authentic. Just as you might imagine, there are ersatz and not really up to snuff artifacts out on the market. Also brandished as part of the museum collection was a .38 caliber, long barrel Colt seized by law enforcement from one Frankie C. Camarata. He was a confidant of Luciano, and Jimmy Hoffa, who was a member of the Purple Gang, a renowned bootlegging and hell-raising crew. Camacho was eventually deported to Cuba, where he was thrown into prison by Fidel Castro for narcotics trafficking and died while locked up. But not this chair, which is the very picture of the mob's violent train, and a haircut gone bad. 6. Jolene Hughes, Delroy Motel. A RCPD detective and DCI special agent went to the Delroy Motel at 3737 Sturgis Road to check on a witness they had been working with. The investigators found 22-year-old Jolene Hughes deceased in her motel room, with multiple stab wounds. Hughes grew up in Iowa, and met Aj Ripito in Ft. Dodge. She moved with Ripito to Sioux City, where she began working as a prostitute. She was deeply involved in the drug culture and outlaw motorcycle gangs in Sioux City, and eventually worked as an informant for the Sioux Falls Police Department. Her assistance led to the incarceration of numerous offenders, including Ripito. Hughes was scheduled to testify against several suspects in the fall of 1975. She continued working with law enforcement, and was moved to Sturgis. While in Sturgis, Hughes was beaten and raped by 3 males trying to purchase drugs from her. The rape case also remains unsolved. 2 days after the rape, Hughes moved to the Delroy Motel in Rapid City, where she lived for a month before her murder. The investigation into her death was conducted as a joint effort by the Rapid City Police Department, Pennington County Sheriff's Office, and SD Division of Criminal Investigation. Numerous suspects were interviewed, and several promising leads turned cold. One suspect bragged to others about finding and killing Hughes for money. He denied killing Hughes to police, and a polygraph examination confirmed his statement. Another possible suspect was found murdered and buried in a cornfield in North Sioux City in 1977. James Cowell, a member of the El Forestos motorcycle gang, was charged in the suspect's murder, along with his girlfriend and 2 mechanics. All leads in the murder of Jolene Hughes have been exhausted, and the case remains unsolved. 7. John Weaver and Kirsten Prapanpoj, Sawmill River Motel. September will mark 20 years since 2 clerks at the Sawmill River Motel in Elmsford were shot in the head in a brutal, daylight robbery. John Weaver, 32, who grew up in the Tarrytown area, wasn't on duty but had stopped by the motel to get his paycheck after working the midnight shift. The clerk on duty, Kirsten K. Prapanpoj, 50, was shot twice in the head. She lingered in a coma for 5 years before she also died of her injuries, making the crime a double homicide. The failure to solve the case despite some tantalizing clues has haunted both their families and law enforcement. I remember it like it was yesterday, said Elmsford Police Chief Steve Foster, then a detective who arrived at the scene soon after 4:30 p.m., September 5, 1995, shootings. Not a day goes by that we don't think about it. Weaver's brother, James, was a former Tarrytown police chief. He called detectives regularly asking, in vain, if they had made progress until he died in 2004. "I haven't heard anything from the police in the last few years," said Patricia Mersick of Indiana, John Weaver's sister. The Sawmill River Motel is now the Days in Elmsford and looks the same as it did 20 years ago. Investigators go over the case every now and then to see if there's something they missed. "We haven't closed the case," said Elmsford Mayor Robert Williams. "But sometimes you hit a dead end." There were no eyewitnesses to the crime. The robber made off with about $400. No useful fingerprints were found at the scene. A big clue emerged about 6 months after the shooting. The weapon, a Raver .25 caliber handgun, was recovered in Central Park in Manhattan. Tests showed that 3 days before it was found, the gun had been used to kill Abe Lebwall, owner of the 2nd Avenue Deli, as he took $12,000 to the bank near his East Village restaurant. Police have checked guest logs to see if people at the motel had criminal records and have looked closely at some former employees of both the motel and the restaurant. Police eliminated another possible clue, a red Toyota with a spare tire seen at the motel around the time of the robbery, Foster said. Both the Elmsford killings and the shooting death of the New York City deli owner remain unsolved. Rewards for information have been offered, but that has not yielded the answer to the question that investigators and family members have asked for nearly 20 years: who shot and killed 2 people over $400? 8. Rose Burkett and Roger Atkinson Amana Holiday Inn. In September 1980, Rose Burkett and Roger Atkinson were hoping to have a romantic weekend away when they checked into the Amana Holiday Inn near Williamsburg, Iowa. What they got, however, was far from that. The day after they checked in, housekeeping went to clean the room but received no response from inside. Upon entering, the housekeeper saw feet peeking out from under the bed sheets and assumed that the couple was asleep. But when she peered in a little further, she discovered a grisly sight. Blood was splattered on the walls, the carpet, and across the bed's headboard. The couple was lying face down on the bed with their skulls beaten in, most likely by an axe or hatchet. Their hands and fingers also showed defensive wounds, as if they had tried to protect their heads from the blows. In each case, the cause of death was determined to be acute blood loss and brain injuries. There was no forced entry into the room. In fact, it looked like the couple had been entertaining because there were 2 chairs pulled up to the bed and evidence that someone had put their feet up on the hotel desk. The only thing really strange and out of place was the word "this" written on the bathroom mirror with soap. Over 400 people were interviewed about the murders, including hotel employees and close friends of the deceased. The prime suspect was Burkett's ex-boyfriend Danny Burton. Burkett had a restraining order against him and had told authorities that he would be responsible if anything ever happened to her. However, Burton passed a polygraph test, and his alibi checked out. Another suspect was Atkinson's uncle Charles Hatcher, a serial killer who had recently escaped from a Nebraska mental health center. But he was never brought in for questioning. "We're coming up on a time of the year when it's painful to reminisce, but God's seen me through what time I've had without him and that's how I've gotten through," said Marcella Schatt, Atkinson's widow. Schatt said she began dating Roger when she was 15 years old, and they celebrated their 7th anniversary on September 1st, just before his death. "It was a big loss when it happened. But time goes on and time does heal wounds," Schatt said. Howard Judd, a captain with the Buchanan County Sheriff's Department who worked the case, said the murders were pretty gruesome, according to the news press article. Judd is now retired. Both victims were lying face down on the bed, and the back of their heads were sliced and caved in by repeated strikes from either an axe or hatchet. Several of Atkinson's fingers were severed, which appeared to be a defensive wound. There was no indication of a forced entry or struggle, according to the cold case website. Tammy Berkman, Savannah, Missouri, said her life was turned upside down when Rose died. She met Rose in high school. They later became roommates, co-workers, and at her wedding Rose was the maid of honor. "I could talk to her about anything," Berkman said. "My brothers and sisters are a lot older than me and I don't see them real often, so she was just like a sister to me." Schatt was led to believe that Roger, who worked as a telephone crew member, was in Cahokia, Missouri on a 2-week work project. She hopes publicizing the murders will defrost the cold case. There is a key person that knows what happened, Shat said. If that key person would just step forward and give us some information, I think it could be solved. After the murders, rumors became rampant in Iowa and St. Joseph as the list of suspects mounted. Shat said rumors are circulating once again about a member of Rose's family being a suspect. The authorities are tight-lipped, Shat said. I ask a lot, but they won't give any information out. Berkman created a Facebook page for Rose. I still love her, I miss her a lot. I feel that people think since it's been 36 years that her and Roger are just a case number that doesn't matter anymore, and they weren't, they were people, Berkman said. Sheriff Robert Trotter with the Iowa County Sheriff's Office said detectives returned to St. Joseph last month to get a full grasp of the case. They revisited witnesses and collected blood samples to compare against any new discoveries. He said evidence was sent to a lab in the winter for an initial touch DNA test, which can analyze skin cells left on an object. They are awaiting results. Berkman said solving the case would allow her friend to rest in peace. It would never bring her back, but at least I can tell her, I didn't let it go and we did it and we pushed it until something was done, Berkman said. Even if you think it's a small thing, go ahead and call them, it doesn't hurt to call and give them the information, Shat said. There is no justice in something like this, you can't bring those two people back. So I would hope for some closure to just put an end to the chapter. 9. Gerry Buckley, Hotel La Salle. During the 1920s, Detroit recorded 1,284 homicides and had one of the highest murder rates in the country. The killing didn't stop once the calendar flipped to 1930. In fact, until a growing economic depression and the repeal of prohibition saw murders drop and property crimes rise, the new decade was simply a continuation of the old. In the first 2 weeks of July 1930, at least 11 gangland figures were killed. Mayor Charles Bowles was viewed as being inept, aloof, and in the pocket of criminals, leading frustrated citizens to successfully petition for a special recall election. Bowles' most powerful critic was WCHB radio host Gerry Buckley, who nightly used the power of the airwaves to attack corruption and espouse populist causes. Buckley, 39, came from an old Corktown neighborhood family and was revered by his listeners. Curiously, the voice of the common man did not originally support the recall, calling it undemocratic, until changing his mind just before the election. Detroiters voted overwhelmingly on July 22, 1930. To oust Bowles. After spending the night covering returns at City Hall, Buckley returned to the La Salle, where WCHB had its studios, and the commentator kept a suite. A phone call from an unidentified woman brought him to the lobby, where he took a chair and waited. At 1:45 a.m., 3 men strode in, drew revolvers, and fired a flurry of shots at point-blank range. After the gunmen fled, a stunned hotel employee used the newspaper Buckley had been reading to cover his exploded head. The assassination sickened a city already fed up with lawlessness, helping to make Buckley's funeral one of the largest Detroit had ever seen. But grief turned into disbelief when the press published unflattering revelations about the martyred crusader. The most damning was that Buckley had extorted money from racketeers in exchange for going easy on them. Sometimes he played both ends against the middle, shaking down opposing parties. Suddenly, his about-face on the recall suggested something other than a sincere change of heart. Beyond the allegations of blackmail was Buckley's reputation for womanizing and enjoying the high life. Any of these activities could have made him a target. A grand jury returned indictments against 3 men, all linked to East Side gangster Pete Lickerley. Ted Pinner had been a tenant at the La Salle. Police found him in bed shortly after the murder, still partially clothed. His roommate, Angelo Livecchi, was nabbed in New York just as he was hastily arranging a trip to Italy. Scarface Joe Bomarito also was arrested. Each was charged with first-degree murder. The court battle raged on for weeks and public interest was sustained to a proper pitch throughout, wrote Free Press police reporter Charlie Horn. Theory after theory for Buckley's murder revolved around the jury's collective heads. Buckley was killed because of his action against those interested in keeping Mayor Bowles in office. Killed because of a double cross. killed because of a woman. You could take your choice. A key witness, Frank Tara, was brought in under heavy police guard. Tara testified he was standing outside the hotel's Adelaide Street entrance when he heard gunshots in the lobby. Moments later, two men he later identified as Pino and Livetti rushed past him and jumped into a waiting getaway car. After newspapers published his photograph, Tara refused to take the stand again. "It's my death sentence," he exclaimed. The terrified witness was held in contempt and his testimony stricken, dealing a major blow to the prosecution. After 6 weeks, the case finally went to the jury. Loud arguing could be heard behind closed doors. 35 hours later, jurors emerged with a verdict, not guilty. There are many unanswered questions about Buckley's murder and about Buckley himself. Today, some armchair criminologists name a different set of gunmen: John Mirabella, Joe English, and Russell Syracuse, all of whom fled to Youngstown, Ohio, as the likely killers, though the exact motive behind such a high-profile slaying remains speculative. Detroit has chalked up more than 25,000 homicides in the 80 years since Buckley was gunned down. After all this time, his murder is still on the books, a classic cold case and a chilling reminder of what human beings are capable of doing to one another, no matter what the era. 10. Linda Mayfield, Starlight Motel. The brutal death of Linda Mayfield is one of Council Bluffs' coldest cold cases. The unsolved stabbing death of a woman police believe was a prostitute on April 9, 1982, at the old Starlight Motel, now Deluxe Motel, at 3320 W. Broadway, remains unsolved. At 2:18 a.m., officers with the Council Bluffs Police Department were called to the motel regarding a disturbance involving a man with knife, according to the police report. When officers arrived, Mayfield, 21, was found laying face down by the north office door. The responding officer said she had several stab wounds to her face, chest, stomach, hand and foot. Mayfield was pronounced dead at 4 a.m. at Mercy Hospital. Police officers interviewed witnesses and released information on a possible suspect in the fatal stabbing of Mayfield. A friend of Mayfield's described to police a white man she believed to have committed the stabbing is around 26 to 28 years old and standing between 5'7" and 5'10". The man was clean-shaven and wearing a blue jean jacket, light blue pullover shirt with an emblem and blue jeans. Council Bluffs Police Sergeant Chad Mayers said that after talking with other witnesses at the time, the alleged attacker could have been as old as 38 and possibly drove an early 80s red Ford Mustang. Several witnesses said the man went by Chris. "We suspect that Linda probably was a prostitute, and Chris probably solicited her services that night," Mayers said. While the police department has lots of information on the alleged attacker, the case remains unsolved, and, in a lot of ways, forgotten. "In the 6 years that I have worked as a supervisor in the Detective Bureau, we haven't gotten one tip on the Linda Mayfield homicide," Mayers said. "I don't know when was the last time we have gotten one on that case." The police department still has DNA evidence from the case periodically tested. "As technology advances, we need less and less of a sample for us to develop a DNA profile," Mayers said. "Time is our enemy. This happened in 1982, so this took place 30 years ago. If the suspect was in his late 30s at that time, now you're looking at someone who is well into his 70s. That's true with witnesses, too. That's what makes it hard when you look at cases from the 70s and 80s. Law enforcement officials can use a DNA index system called CODIS to find DNA matches. Whenever an offender is arrested and taken to a detention facility, he or she is tested to see if he or she is connected to an unsolved crime." Mayers said this program could help find Mayfield's killer. "We still want to find who did this," he said. "Anybody who has any information on this case or any other unsolved homicide, we definitely want to talk this them." A murder case has no statute of limitations, so a suspect arrested in connection to Mayfield's murder could still be tried. While more than 30 years have passed, cold cases do get solved, Mayers said, pointing to the recent convictions of James Derek Dove and James Kane Harris. In 2002, 11 years after the rape and murder Marcia Krause, a deaf woman from Council Bluffs, Dove was sentenced to 100 years in prison. In 2014, 11 years after Nelson Alvarez Hernandez was stabbed to death on Council Bluffs South End, Harris was sentenced to life imprisonment for the killing.